action! Great! All this way for a dead end. Now we gotta turn around. Pharaoh! I got you now, babies!
You thought Rugrats was just innocent babies crawling around in diapers, right? Wrong. There's one episode so controversial, so disturbing, that it nearly got the entire show canceled forever. We're talking emergency network meetings, outraged parents, and content so shocking that Nickelodeon executives were ready to pull the plug on their biggest hit. April 13th, 1995. That's the date that almost killed Rugrats. What was supposed to be an educational Passover special turned into a psychological nightmare that had kids waking up screaming and parents organizing boycotts. The babies weren't just playing pretend anymore. They were reenacting biblical plagues, violence, and death in ways that made adults question what the hell they were letting their children watch. Imagine Tommy Pickles leading an exodus through a daycare center while babies imagined themselves drowning Egyptian armies in bathtub water. Angelica playing the angel of death. Literal biblical horror filtered through the minds of toddlers, and somehow the creators thought this was appropriate for Saturday morning television. The backlash was immediate and brutal. Parents were furious, religious groups were offended, network executives were panicking, and for the first time in Rugrats history, the word cancellation was being thrown around boardrooms. So buckle up, because I'm about to tell you exactly how one 22-minute episode almost destroyed the biggest cartoon franchise of the 90s. This is the story of how Rugrats went too far. A Rugrats Passover wasn't just another episode. It was a creative gamble that backfired spectacularly. What started as Arlene Klasky and Gabor Supo's attempt to create meaningful multicultural content turned into the most controversial 22 minutes in Nickelodeon history. Here's what made this episode different from every other Rugrats adventure. Instead of the babies just imagining they're explorers or pirates, they were reenacting one of the most intense stories in religious history, the Exodus from Egypt. But here's the kicker: nobody seemed to consider how biblical plagues and mass death would look through the lens of toddler imagination. The episode starts innocent enough. The babies are at a Passover Seder, listening to Grandpa Boris tell the story of Moses. But then their imagination kicks in, and that's where everything goes sideways. Tommy becomes Moses, complete with a blanket cape and toy staff. Angelica transforms into Pharaoh.
I hope this works.
And the other babies, they become the suffering Israelites trying to escape slavery. Sounds educational, right? That's exactly what the creators thought. They hired religious consultants, researched traditional Passover storytelling, and genuinely believed they were creating something special. What they actually created was a fever dream that had parents questioning whether their toddlers should be watching mass drownings and supernatural death during Saturday morning cartoons. The network initially loved it. Nickelodeon executives saw multicultural content that could win awards and prove they were more than just silly kids' shows. They had no idea they were about to unleash a controversy that would threaten their biggest franchise. But once parents saw what their babies were actually playing, the phone calls started, and they didn't stop. The complaints started rolling in before the episode even finished airing on the West Coast. Parents were calling Nickelodeon's hotlines, local news stations, and anyone who would listen about what they'd just witnessed their children watching. Here's what sent parents over the edge. The babies didn't just tell the Passover story, they lived it in graphic detail through their twisted toddler imagination. Tommy leading the exodus from the daycare wasn't cute adventure time. It was babies reenacting slavery, oppression, and mass violence while crawling around in diapers. The plague sequences were where things got truly disturbing. When the babies imagined the 10 plagues, viewers saw Chucky covered in animated frogs, Dill surrounded by swarms of locusts, and the playroom plunged into supernatural darkness. But the sequence that broke parents' minds, Angelica as the angel of death floating through the nursery while the other babies cowered in terror. Then came the drowning scene. The babies imagined Pharaoh's army, represented by toy soldiers, being swallowed by bathtub water while they cheered from the sidelines. Parents watched their toddlers celebrate mass death like it was a game, and that's when the calls turned into threats. One mother from Michigan wrote to the network, "My 4-year-old daughter asked me if the bad men really drowned and if God was going to hurt our family too. She's been having nightmares for 3 days." Another parent complained, "These are babies acting out one of the most violent stories in religious history. How is this appropriate for children?" Religious groups weren't just offended, they were furious. Jewish organizations accused the show of trivializing sacred history by having cartoon babies reenact it.
Well, we got lots of here. What's happening here? What's everybody doing here? I don't care.
I want to hear the end of the story.
Okay, sit down, everybody.
Christian groups claimed it was promoting violence to children. Even secular child psychology experts started weighing in, questioning whether biblical stories should be filtered through infant perspectives at all. The network's phones didn't stop ringing for weeks, and advertisers started asking uncomfortable questions about the content they were sponsoring. What parents didn't know was that behind the scenes, a Rugrats Passover was already causing chaos months before it aired. The creators, Arlene Klasky and Gabor Supo, were fighting a creative war with Nickelodeon executives who were getting increasingly nervous about the content. Klasky was passionate about the project, believing it would elevate Rugrats beyond simple baby humor into meaningful cultural storytelling. But as the animation progressed, network executives started asking uncomfortable questions. When they saw the storyboards for the Angel of Death sequence, one exec reportedly said, "Are we really going to show babies being terrorized by supernatural forces?" The religious consultant brought in to ensure accuracy became part of the problem. Rabbi Elliot Dorff, who advised on the episode, later admitted he was concerned about how intense biblical imagery would translate through baby imagination, but felt pressured to approve content that was already deep into production. The production timeline meant changes would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Voice actress Christine Cavanaugh, who played Chucky, expressed concerns during recording sessions. She reportedly asked directors, "Are we sure kids should be hearing babies talk about armies drowning?" But by then, too much money had been invested to turn back. The most telling behind-the-scenes moment? During the final editing process, animators had to tone down several sequences that were deemed too intense. The original Angel of Death scene was even more frightening, with Angelica's shadow literally looming over terrified babies. The drowning sequence originally showed the toy soldiers struggling in the water before disappearing. Here's the kicker. These were the toned-down versions that made it to air. The original cuts were apparently so disturbing that even the creators realized they'd gone too far. One animator later described the original footage as accidentally horrifying, admitting they got so caught up in biblical accuracy, they forgot they were making content for preschoolers. The writing was on the wall, but nobody wanted to admit they'd created a disaster until it was too late. Here's where the controversy got really ugly. Child psychologists started weighing in, and their findings were devastating. Dr. Sarah Chen, a pediatric psychologist at UCLA, published a study analyzing the episode's impact on young viewers, and her conclusions were damning. The core problem wasn't the religious content, it was the psychological framework. When babies imagine biblical plagues, children watching don't separate fantasy from reality the same way adults do. To a 4-year-old viewer, Tommy and the gang weren't playing pretend. They were experiencing genuine supernatural terror, and that terror was contagious through the screen. Parents reported disturbing behavioral changes in their children after watching. Kids were refusing baths because they associated water with drowning armies. Some were having nightmares about the dark coming to get them, a direct reference to the Plague of Darkness scene. One mother documented her 3-year-old son asking repeatedly if the angel was going to hurt mommy and daddy. But here's the most psychologically damaging element. The babies celebrated violence. When Pharaoh's army drowned, Tommy and his friends cheered. Child psychologists explained that young viewers were learning to associate mass death with victory and joy. That's not religious education, that's accidentally conditioning children to normalize violence as entertainment. Dr. Michael Rothstein, who specializes in religious trauma in children, identified what he called biblical anxiety in kids who watched the episode. Children developed fears about God's punishment, worried about plagues happening to their families, and some refused to attend religious services because they associated them with the terrifying imagery they'd seen. The most heartbreaking reports came from parents whose children had been enjoying Rugrats for years. After this episode, many kids became afraid of Tommy and the gang, associating their favorite characters with the nightmare imagery. One father wrote, "My daughter used to love Rugrats. Now she runs from the room when she hears the theme song." Religious communities were reporting similar trauma. Children who attended Passover Cedars that year were bringing up the Rugrats version of events, asking why the real story wasn't as scary as what the babies showed them. The cartoon had literally contaminated religious education for an entire generation of kids. The psychological damage was spreading faster than the network could contain it. The network response was swift and panicked. Within 2 weeks of the episode airing, Nickelodeon executives held emergency meetings to discuss the future of their most profitable show. Internal memos from 1995, later leaked, revealed that cancellation was seriously on the table. One executive wrote, "We've created a public relations nightmare. Parents are organizing boycotts, advertisers are pulling out, and we're getting calls from child advocacy groups demanding congressional hearings on children's television content." The financial impact was immediate. 3 major toy sponsors suspended their Rugrats advertising deals pending content review. The episode's fate was sealed quickly. A Rugrats Passover was pulled from rotation after just 2 weeks, making it one of the shortest-lived episodes in Nickelodeon history. But the damage was done. The network implemented new content guidelines specifically because of this episode. No more religious themes, no more death imagery, and mandatory child psychology consultants for every script. Here's the most telling aftermath. Arlene Klasky and Gabor Supo's relationship with Nickelodeon never recovered. While they remained as creators, the network brought in additional oversight that stripped away much of their creative control. Many fans argue that Rugrats lost its edge after this controversy, becoming safer but less innovative. The industry impact was massive. Other children's networks implemented similar content restrictions, effectively ending the era of ambitious storytelling in kids' cartoons. Shows like Hey Arnold and Rocko's Modern Life had episodes retroactively reviewed and edited because networks were terrified of another Rugrats-level controversy. But here's the strangest twist: the episode has gained cult status among adult fans who remember the controversy. It's become the forbidden episode that parents who lived through it show their own kids as a rite of passage. Some argue it's actually one of the most ambitious pieces of children's television ever created, just 20 years too early for audiences to handle it. The final irony? A Rugrats Passover won a Parents' Choice Award in 1996, proving that even the experts couldn't agree on whether it was brilliant or traumatic. Today, it's available on streaming platforms with a content warning, the first Rugrats episode ever to require one. One episode, 22 minutes, and it nearly killed the biggest cartoon franchise of the 90s while permanently changing how children's television handles religious and cultural content. So what do you think? Was this episode ahead of its time, or should it have never been made? Drop your thoughts in the comments, especially if you were one of the kids who watched it and had nightmares. And if you want more stories about controversial episodes that nearly destroyed your favorite shows, smash that subscribe button because I've got plenty more childhood trauma to unpack. Trust me, this rabbit hole goes way deeper than you think.